He had always trusted in the strength of their love, in the honesty of their marriage, but in the final moments of her life, his wife confessed the secret she had been hiding all along. The year was 1955. In a world fractured by color, the United States still held fast to the chains of racial segregation. Jim Crow laws were the invisible architects of society, dictating where a black man could walk, eat, sit, or even cast his gaze. Interracial relationships weren't merely frowned upon, they were a lit fuse. A black man found in the wrong place with a white woman could face a beating, a prison cell, or something far worse. The South was a furnace of this unspoken code. But the North, though less overtly brutal, was no sanctuary. Elias Vance had learned these lessons from birth. Born into the grip of poverty in a small southern town, he had spent his life watching men like his father buckle under the weight of a system engineered to keep them down. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a weary soul who spent more time on her knees scrubbing the floors of white homes than in her own. Elias had worked from the moment he could stand, fixing cars beside his uncles, learning the language of engines as they breathed and groaned under the strain of labor. By 18, he was a mechanic in a small auto shop, one of the few trades where a black man could earn a decent wage without serving a white boss at his table. Elias was tall and powerfully built, his skin the color of rich, polished ebony. He possessed a quiet confidence that unsettled white men and, to his peril, intrigued white women, a dangerous alchemy in the world he inhabited. But Elias had never been foolish enough to play with such fire. He had seen the ashes of black boys who let their eyes linger too long on pale skin. That was until Clara Sterling. Clara had never known a day of want. Born into a prominent white family, her childhood was a blur of silk dresses and expensive shoes, her days meticulously arranged with etiquette lessons and social gatherings designed to sculpt her into the ideal Southern bride. Her father, Alistair Sterling, was a man of immense influence, a businessman whose fortune was built not just on investments, but on the power he wielded over others. He was a firm believer in bloodlines, in purity, in the inherent superiority of those who shared his complexion. But Clara had never felt at home in her father's meticulously crafted world. She had grown up suffocating beneath the weight of expectations she had no desire to fulfill. She was meant to be demure, obedient, silent. Instead, she was restless, curious, forever searching for a life beyond the gilded cage laid out for her. The night she met Elias, she was 18. The summer heat was a thick blanket on her skin as she slipped into a dress she'd been told was too daring, too revealing. The air tasted of whiskey and cigarette smoke as she descended into the dimly lit basement where the music of rebellion played. Jazz, smooth and electric, its notes curling around the sharp edges of segregation like whispers of defiance. The party was one of those rare secret spaces where the lines of color blurred. Young people, black, white, and every shade between, came together in the shadows, sharing drinks, laughter, and glances that could never survive the light of day. It was there Elias first saw her. She was unlike any white woman he had been, warned away from. There was no fear in her eyes when they met his, no hesitation as she moved toward him. Her blonde hair fell over her shoulders like a waterfall, her blue eyes alive with a dangerous mixture of curiosity, excitement, and defiance. She asked for his name. He paused. She smiled, and suddenly Elias found himself speaking, his voice low and cautious, as if testing the very air between them. They talked for what felt like hours, their words weaving a connection in the space around them. She was captivated by the world he came from, the cadence of his speech, the landscape of his thoughts. He was wary but drawn in by her boldness. By the way, she seemed untouched by the fear that was the constant companion of his own life. It was intoxicating. It was reckless. It was inevitable. As the night drew to a close, she told him she wanted to see him again. He knew he should walk. Away. He didn't. The first time her father saw them together, it was an accident. Elias had been working late at the auto shop when Clara appeared at the edge of the garage, her pale skin glowing under the halo of a street lamp. His heart seized, his pulse hammering in his ears. She shouldn't be here. It wasn't safe. But before he could hurry her away, a polished black car slid to the curb. Alistair Sterling emerged, and the world seemed to freeze. Elias saw the precise moment understanding dawned in the man's eyes, the way his face contorted with rage, his body tensing with a fury that only white men had the privilege of displaying openly. Clara tried to speak, but her father silenced her with a glare so cold it could have turned the summer air to ice. Then, without a single word, he seized her by the arm and dragged her away. Elias remained rooted to the spot. He knew better than to follow. The next morning a note was slipped under the garage door. "Stay away from my daughter." It wasn't a warning, it was a promise. And for the first time in his life, Elias realized he wasn't afraid of men like Alistair Sterling. He was afraid of what he was willing to risk for Clara. The weeks that followed were a living hell. Clara was forbidden to leave the house. Every move was watched, every call monitored. Her father refused to speak to her, as if her very existence was a stain upon him. Her mother said nothing, only observing her with hollow, unreadable eyes. Clara fought back. She screamed, she argued, she begged, but her father's will was absolute, and no court would ever side with a daughter who dared to defy the man who owned her world. And yet she found a way. A letter tucked into the pocket of a delivery boy, a whisper in the ear of a maid who remembered, a love that crossed color lines, a meeting in the dead of night when the world was blind. She found Elias again, and this time she told him what he already knew. Her father would never permit them to be together. But she had made her choice. She had chosen him. It was a reckless, dangerous decision. A white woman running away with a black man wasn't just scandalous. It was a crime. There would be no mercy, no understanding, no forgiveness. But love has never paid heed to laws. And so, in the deep of night, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the fire in their hearts, they ran. They ran from the chains of her father's power, from the crushing weight of a world that would never accept them. They ran toward a future that held no guarantees, no promises, and no safety. There was only the hope that together they could carve out a life of their own. They had no idea that the real danger was only just beginning. The night air was heavy with the gravity of their choice. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the small suitcase she had packed in secret, filled with only the barest essentials, a dress, a few coins, and a photograph of her mother she couldn't explain why she'd brought. It was staggering how little of her life she could carry with her. Everything she had ever known, her home, her name, her status, she was leaving behind. Elias stood at the edge of town, waiting in the deep shadows of the abandoned train station. He had no suitcase, no photographs. His entire life had always been light enough to carry. When she saw him, she felt an urge to run to him, to throw herself into his arms and let the fear dissolve. But she held herself rigid. There was no room for softness, no time for hesitation. They had one chance to vanish. The train that would carry them north was due within the hour. It was a freight train, bound for a factory town in Viridian, where mixed-race couples were a rarity, but not an illegality. It was their only real option. Clara glanced over her shoulder one last time, half expecting to see her father's men thundering toward her, ready to drag her back to the life she had just escaped. But the streets were silent and empty. Still, the fear coiled in her gut. Elias took her hand. His was rough, calloused, and steady. "Are you sure?" His voice was quiet but unshakable. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. They boarded. The train concealing themselves among crates and sacks of grain. No one saw them depart. No one knew where they were headed. For the first time in her life, Clara was free. The journey was long and punishing. They traveled in near total darkness, their bodies aching from crouching in the cramped space between cargo boxes. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels became the soundtrack to their escape, each clang a reminder that there was no going back. Elias spoke very little. He was always listening, always watching. Every time the train ground to a halt, he would tense, waiting for the sound of approaching footsteps, for the heavy doors to slide open and reveal men with guns, ready to tear their world apart. But no one ever came. On the second night, they reached Viridian. The factory town was a world away from the manicured streets of Clara's childhood. The air was thick with smoke, the streets lined with buildings stained by soot, the people's faces etched with the weariness of long hours of labor. But here, they were just another couple. No one looked twice at a white woman standing beside a black man. It wasn't acceptance, it was indifference. And indifference was a kind of sanctuary. They found lodging in a cramped boarding house where the walls were paper-thin and privacy was a forgotten luxury. Their room was barely large enough for the narrow bed they shared, but it was theirs. Elias found a job at the local steel mill, enduring 12-hour shifts in unbearable heat. Clara found work as a seamstress. Her fingers soon blistered from endless hours of stitching. It was hard, grueling work, nothing like the life she had known. But she never complained because, for the first time, this was a life she had chosen. The marriage took place in a tiny church on the edge of town. There were no guests, no flowers, no music. There was only the two of them and a preacher who barely looked at them as he mumbled the vows. There was no ring, no celebration, just a quiet exchange of promises spoken not for the world, but for each other. When the ceremony was over, Clara stood outside the church staring up at the gray sky, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. She was no longer Clara Sterling, daughter of privilege. She was Clara Vance, wife of a black man in a world that would never fully embrace them. And yet she felt lighter than she ever had before. The first year of marriage was a trial by fire. The factory town was safer than the South, but that did not make it kind. Elias's co-workers kept their distance, wary of the man who had a white wife. The women in the town looked at Clara with suspicious eyes, unsure if she was lost, confused, or simply a fool. They were tolerated but never truly welcomed. Money was a constant struggle. Some nights they went to bed with their stomachs aching from hunger. Clara learned to mend clothes until they were more stitch than fabric. Elias learned to stretch every dollar, haggling for scraps at the market, working overtime until his body screamed in protest. But they held on because love had carried them this far. And yet, love did not extinguish fear. Clara's father had not forgotten her. Letters began to arrive at the boarding house, each one colder than the last. The first was a command, "Come home now." The second was a warning, "You don't understand what you've done." The third was a threat, "You will regret this." Clara burned them all, but the fear remained, a persistent ember. Her father was not a man who accepted defeat. One day he would find her, and she could not imagine what he would do when he did. That fear bled into her dreams. It whispered in the back of her mind as she walked through the market, when she saw men in suits glancing at her for a moment too long, when she heard footsteps behind her in the dark. And so, without telling Elias, she began to save money. At first it was just a few coins tucked beneath the mattress, then a few bills hidden in the hem of a dress. She told herself it was nothing, just a precaution, a habit born from years of fear, not from a lack of faith. But deep down she knew the truth. She had chosen Elias, but a part of her still feared that one day she might have to leave him behind. The years passed, and life in the factory town settled into a rhythm. It was never easy, never truly comfortable, but it was their life. Elias worked himself to the bone, returning home each night with aching muscles and hands stained with soot. Clara stitched clothes until her fingers bled, her once delicate hands now rough and calloused. They built a life together, piece by fragile piece, and then their first child came. Clara had never been more terrified. She had anticipated joy, had pictured the moment she would place her newborn in Elias's arms and feel the warmth of their growing family. But when she saw the tiny boy swaddled in blankets, she felt something else entirely: guilt. Because as she looked at her son, she couldn't stop thinking about the child she had abandoned. She had been 17, a different girl living a different life. Her family had concealed the pregnancy, hiding her away behind closed doors, telling friends she had fallen ill and needed rest. She had never been given a choice. When the baby was born, a boy just like this one, she had barely been allowed to hold him before he was taken from her. Her father had arranged everything: a quiet adoption, a discreet payment, ensuring there would be no records, no link to the sterling name. Clara had wept for weeks, but over time she had learned to silence the ache. She told herself it was for the best, that the child would have a better life without her, without the shadow of scandal. Then she had met Elias, and she had buried that past beneath a new life, a new love. But now, holding her newborn son, the past clawed its way back to the surface. She had another child out there, a son who had been lost to her before he even had a chance to know her. She never told Elias. She couldn't. The weight of that secret settled into her bones, a quiet, gnawing guilt that would never fully leave her. Their son Rowan grew quickly. His skin was a rich blend of his parents' colors, his eyes sharp like his father's, his smile soft like his mother's. He was the first thing they had ever truly built together, a living, breathing testament to their love. And yet, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She dreamed of the child she had given away. She wondered if he looked like Rowan, if he had her nose or Elias's steady gaze. She wondered if he ever thought about the mother he had never known. She never spoke of it. Instead, she buried it deeper, devoting herself to Rowan, to Elias, to their life. But the past has a way of finding you even when you try to outrun it. Years passed, and another child arrived, Lyra. She was a wild thing from the start, loud and fearless, her laughter filling the small rooms of their home. She had none of her mother's quiet contemplation, none of her father's reserved strength. She was a force of nature, a storm in a little girl's body. Clara adored her, but with each passing year, the secret grew heavier. She would imagine the boy, now a young man, living in some unknown city, perhaps in a house much like theirs, perhaps wondering who he was. She prayed he had a good life. She prayed he never felt abandoned. And she prayed Elias would never find out. But secrets have a way of poisoning everything. Clara became quieter, more withdrawn, Elias noticed. At first, he attributed it to exhaustion. Parenthood was demanding, and their life was a constant struggle. But then he saw it in the way she would stare into the distance, lost in a place he couldn't reach, in the way she would hesitate before answering questions about her childhood, in the way she flinched whenever the topic of adoption was mentioned, even in passing. Elias was not a man who pried. He respected silence, understood that some wounds were too deep to touch. But this felt different. This was his wife, and she was slipping away from him. One night, long after the children were asleep, he found her sitting at the small wooden table in their kitchen, staring at a torn piece of fabric in her lap. She didn't notice him at first, and for the first time in their marriage, Elias felt a chasm between them that terrified him. There were things she was not telling him, things she might never tell him, and for the first time he wondered if he truly knew his wife at all. Clara had always known that marriage was not the fairy tale spun in books and films. She had understood, even as a girl, that love and survival were often two different paths. But she had never expected to find herself in a marriage built on both. Elias was a good husband. He was steady, patient, and reliable. He worked tirelessly to provide for her and the children, never once complaining about the bone-deep exhaustion that came with 12-hour shifts at the steel mill. And he loved her. Of that she had no doubt. But she carried a secret that weighed heavier than any love could lighten. Because when she had married him, she had not done it for love. She had done it out of fear. She had grown up knowing her father would select her husband for her. That was the way of things in families like hers, built on old Southern money and bloodlines that stretched back to colonial wealth. Women did not choose. They were chosen. Her father had spent years grooming her for a suitable match, introducing her to the sons of bankers, lawyers, and powerful businessmen. He had lined them up like prize horses, inspecting them for pedigree, for wealth, for the right kind of arrogance. And she had played the part. She had smiled, nodded, let them take her hand, and lead her across ballroom floors. She had done what was expected, until Elias, until she had seen something different, a man who did not belong in her world, a man who made her question every lesson she had ever been taught. And she had run to him not because she was in love, but because she was terrified of what her life would become if she didn't. The realization sickened her, because now, all these years later, she did love him. She loved the way he kissed her forehead before leaving for work each morning. She loved the low, deep rumble of his voice as he rocked their children to sleep at night. She loved the way he never raised his voice, even when angered. She loved the way he made her feel safe. And yet she had never told him the truth, that when she had married him, it had not been a choice of the heart. It had been an act of survival. She told herself it no longer mattered, that love had grown in time, that it made no difference how their story began as long as it had led them here. But then came the whispers, not from Elias, but from the world around them, from the women at the market who still looked at her as though she were a curiosity, from the men who sneered as Elias passed them on the street, from the children who asked questions she didn't know how to answer. Mama, why do some people look at Daddy like he doesn't belong? Mama, why do the other kids say I'm different? Mama, why doesn't Grandpa ever visit? And she had no answers because the truth was ugly. The truth was that she had spent so many years trying to forget where she came from that she had never stopped to consider what it meant for her children to live in the space between two worlds. And worst of all, she had never told Elias. She had never told him that in those first hardest months when she had been exhausted and scared, she had thought about leaving. She had looked at the money she had hidden away, counting it over and over in the dead of night, wondering if it was enough to take the children and disappear. She had never planned to do it, not really, but the fact that she had even considered. It haunted her. Elias was no fool. He saw the way she dodged certain questions. He saw the hesitation when he asked about her past, the way she grew quiet when their children spoke of race, of belonging, of the things that set them apart. And he wondered not just about her secrets, but about her love. Did she love him because, he was her choice, or because he had been her only escape? It was a question he was too afraid to ask, because he wasn't sure he could bear the answer. Clara had convinced herself that the past was buried. She had built a new life, a family, a home that, while humble, was a safe harbor. The world outside their walls still viewed them with suspicion, but inside they had found something resembling peace. But peace is a fragile thing, and the past has a way of returning when you least expect it. The first letter arrived on an ordinary afternoon. It was slipped under the door while she was out, a thin white envelope resting on the wooden floor like a ghost from another life. She stared at it for a long time before picking it up. There was no return address, just her name scrawled in an unmistakable hand, her father's. Her stomach twisted into a knot as she tore it open. The words inside were short, cold. "You do not understand what you have done." She felt a wave of nausea. It had been years since she had last heard from him. After she had run away, he had sent letters demanding her return, then letters threatening her, then nothing. She had thought, hoped, that he had finally given up. She had been wrong. For weeks she waited for another letter, but none came. She tried to force it from her mind, but the weight of it settled in her chest like a stone. What did he mean? Was it just another attempt to control her, or was it something more? She told herself not to worry, but then she saw the man. It was early evening. She had taken the children to the market, letting them chase each other between the stalls as she bartered for potatoes. And then she saw him. A white man in a suit standing at the corner of the street. He wasn't buying anything. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was just watching her. A chill snaked down her spine. She told herself she was imagining things. But the next day she saw him again. And the day after that. All was at a distance, always. Watching, she didn't tell Elias. She knew what he would say. "You're seeing things. You're worrying over nothing. Or worse, if it is your father, we need to face him." But she didn't want to face him. She just wanted him to stay in the past, where he belonged. And then the second letter came. This one was different. It was not from her father. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message vague. But the words made her heart stop. "I know who you are." She read it again, and she knew. Someone had found out about her first child, about the son she had abandoned all those years ago. A secret she had buried so deep it had nearly turned to dust. And now someone knew. She felt the walls of her world begin to crack. For days she said nothing. She barely slept, barely ate. Oliver noticed. He asked her what was wrong. She told him it was nothing, but he knew better. And when he found the letter crumpled and hidden at the bottom of her dresser drawer, she could see the shift in his eyes, a realization that there were parts of her he had never known, and that maybe after all these years he didn't know his wife at all. Clara had always known the past would catch up to her one day. She had spent years telling herself that the life she had built was separate from the one she had left behind, that the woman she had once been, the privileged daughter of Alistair Sterling, the girl too afraid to fight for her first child, the young bride who had run into Elias's arms, not out of love, but out of desperation, had vanished. But the truth was, that woman had always been inside her, hiding in the shadows of her mind, waiting. And now, as her body began to fail her, and the weight of time pressed down on her bones, she knew her time was up. The sickness had started subtly, a cough, a dizzy spell. But then the pain began, a sharp, relentless ache in her chest that stole her breath and made the simplest movements an agony. Elias noticed first. He watched her struggle to lift a pot from the stove, saw the way she winced when she thought. No one was looking. At first he said nothing, but one night, when she collapsed on the floor while folding laundry, he knew they could no longer ignore it. The doctor came the next morning, a middle-aged white man with an unreadable face. He pressed his fingers to Clara's wrist, listening to the rhythm of her pulse. He asked questions, nodded at her answers, frowned at her silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, too calm. It was the kind of calm that comes before bad news, a kindness that offers no solutions. She was dying. Her heart, he said, was weakening, failing. There was nothing to be done. Elias stood in silence, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Clara closed her eyes. She had expected to feel fear, but all she felt was a profound exhaustion. She had been running for so many years. Maybe it was time to stop. Elias refused to accept it. He spent days searching for another doctor, another opinion, another glimmer of hope. But the answer was always the same. Her time was running out, and Clara knew, more than anything, that she could not leave this world without telling the truth. She had spent a lifetime hoarding secrets. It was time to set them free. One evening, as the sun bled across the rooftops, she asked Elias to sit with her. He hesitated. There was a finality in her voice that frightened him, not of her dying, but of what she was about to say. She told him everything, about the money she had hidden away, about how, in the early years, she had doubted him, had doubted their life, had feared that one day she would need to escape. She told him about her first child, the son she had been forced to abandon, the life she had erased. She told him about her father, how even in death his ghost had haunted her, how she had never truly been free. And finally she told him the most painful truth of all, that she had not married him for love, that she had married him because she had been afraid, because he had been her escape, not her choice. Elias sat in silence. She could not read his expression, could not tell if he felt rage or pain or a vast empty nothing. Tears slipped down her cheeks as the weight of a lifetime of guilt pressed down on her chest. And then she told him the only thing she knew to be absolutely true, that despite everything, the lies, the secrets, the mistakes, she had come to love him, truly, deeply, more than she had ever thought possible. She loved him, and she hoped in the end that would be enough. The days that followed blurred together. Elias said little. He cared for her, held her when the pain became too much, wiped her brow when the fever spiked, carried her to bed when her legs would no longer hold her. But he did not tell her how he felt. She did not ask. She didn't need to know. Because, in the end, it didn't matter. He was still there, and for her, that was enough. One night, as a deep cold crept through the house, and the weight of her own body became too much to bear, she felt Elias's arms around her. He whispered something so soft she barely heard it, and as she closed her eyes for the last time, she smiled, because she knew in that moment that he had forgiven her. Or maybe he hadn't. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe love wasn't about perfection. Maybe it was about choosing to stay, even when it hurt, even when the past could never be undone, even when goodbye was the only thing left to say. The house was too quiet. It was the kind of quiet that sinks into the walls, into the space between breaths, into the hollow left by a body that would never rise again. Clara was gone, and Elias sat in the silence of their bedroom, staring at the empty space beside him, at the pillow that still held the faint imprint of her head. For days he hadn't moved it, as if leaving it untouched could trick him into believing she was still there. But the truth was an unyielding weight. She was gone, and she had left him with a lifetime of secrets. Her confession had broken something inside him, not because she had lied, but because he had never, not once, suspected. For all the years they had spent together, for all the moments they had shared, he had believed in their love. He had believed it was real, built on a foundation of trust, not necessity. And now he didn't know what to believe. Had their life been a lie? Had she ever really chosen him, or had he only ever been an escape, a refuge from a life she didn't want? He had spent his whole life fighting to be seen as a man in a world that insisted he was less, that he was never enough. And now, even in the one place he had called home, in the arms of the woman he had loved, he questioned if he had ever truly belonged. The letters were still there, the ones from her father, yellowed with age, tucked away in the drawer where she had hidden them, the threats, the warnings, and then the last one, the one that had shattered her in those final weeks. I know who you are. A different handwriting, a different fear. She had never told him what it meant, but now he had to know. He opened the drawer, his fingers trembling as he pulled out the stack of old papers, unfolding them one by one. The last letter was brief, a single sentence. Your son is looking for you. Elias froze. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. He read the words again, his breath catching in his throat. Her son. Not Rowan, not Lyra. The one she had given away, the one he had never known existed. His hands tightened around the fragile paper. There had been another child, another piece of her she had kept from him, a son who had been out there somewhere, searching for answers. And now she was gone, and all that remained were questions that could never be answered. Elias sat in the suffocating silence, staring at the letter, at the truth of a life he had never truly known. And for the first time since Clara's death, he let himself grieve, not just for her, but for the life they had built, the life he had thought was real, the life he now realized had been filled with ghosts. The house felt different without her. It wasn't just the emptiness, the absence of her voice, or the quiet rustle of her movements as she folded clothes or hummed in the kitchen. It was something deeper. It was the crushing weight of all the things left unsaid. Elias had spent decades believing he understood his wife, believing that the love they had forged was real, unshakable. Now, in the days following her death, that belief was crumbling, slipping like sand through his fingers. He sat at the kitchen table, the letter laid out before him. "Your son is looking for you." The words felt like a fresh wound. Clara had carried this truth for years. She had let it fester inside her, let it eat away at her soul, and she had never told him. Elias clenched his fists, staring at the faded ink. How could she? How could she sit across from him at the dinner table every night, knowing she had another child in the world? How could she watch their own children grow and never once speak his name? Had she planned to take this secret to her grave? She had confessed so much at the end, the money, the doubts, the fact that she hadn't married him for love, at least not at first. But this she had kept. And now Elias was left to face it alone. Rowan and Lyra didn't understand. They were grieving, but their pain was simple. To them, their mother had been a constant, the steady center of their world. To Elias, she had been more. She had been his partner, his home, the woman he had fought for, the woman he had trusted above all others. Now he wasn't sure what had been real and what had been a carefully constructed illusion. Is love still love if it starts as a lie? He didn't know, and he wasn't sure he wanted to find out. Days passed. Elias worked because it was the only thing that made sense. The steel mill didn't care about his grief. It didn't care that his wife was gone, that his world had fractured beneath his feet. It demanded the same thing from him every day, his sweat, his strength, his time. That at least was simple, but nothing else was. Not when he walked through the market and felt the weight of strangers' eyes on him, their silent questions hanging in the air. Not when he lay in bed at night and reached for her out of habit, only to find the sheets cold and empty. And not when he opened the drawer and saw the letter waiting for him, taunting him with a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. One evening, after the children were asleep, he sat at the table and unfolded the letter again. There was no name, no address, just a single, brutal fact. A son out there, looking for answers. And Elias was the only one left who could give them. He wrestled with it for weeks. What good would it do to look for this boy, this man now? What? Did he owe a stranger who had never been a part of their lives? But then another thought surfaced. What if it had been Rowan? What if someone had taken his son from him, erased him, made him a secret? Wouldn't he want to know? Wouldn't he deserve to? And so, one morning, before the sun had fully risen, Elias left the house. He walked to the post office, the letter clenched in his hand. And for the first time since Clara's death, he made a decision. He would find this boy. He would give him the truth that had been stolen from him, even if it hurt, even if it changed everything, because the past had already taken too much, and Elias wasn't going to let it take anything more.